Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of motor learning and adaptive decision making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to advance law enforcement training, make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Geoffrey Desmoulin. Dr. Desmoulin is a principal of GTD Scientific Incorporated. GTD offers biomechanical consulting services on behalf of clients throughout North America as well as abroad. Focused practice areas include injury biomechanics, incident reconstruction, and physical testing with a subspecialty in the science of violence. GTD has been retained in significant complex injury litigation cases involving municipal police department use of force, violent encounters, and Taser International, to name just a few. Furthermore, landmark testing and shooting reconstruction methodology developed by Dr. Desmoulin has recently upheld as reliable and admissible by the U.S. Federal District Court for the 9th District of California. In addition, Dr. Desmoulin was selected from an international pool of applicants to be the science and engineering host for Viacom Network's hit television show Deadliest Warrior. In this high-profile position, he assessed engineering aspects, injury potential, and overall battlefield effectiveness of weapons used by warriors throughout history. The series filmed 33 episodes and highlighted 64 warriors. Deadliest Warrior continues to air throughout the world in over 16 countries, 32 different languages, and is available in over 96 million homes in the United States alone. Dr. Desmoulin, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for making the time to talk to us today.
Well, thanks for the invite, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I wanted to have you on the show because I became aware that you were involved in some recent research, very important, I think, is going to be a landmark publication, Jeff, regarding prone restraint and restraint techniques in law enforcement and the risk of prone restraints. And this is a concern, as I read through your paper and I thought about this concern about subjects who die suddenly and unexpectedly or immediately following a fierce struggle with law enforcement and trying to get prone control in that prone restraint position is we've had subjects. I joined the law enforcement in 1990, and I think it was 1992 I was involved in an incident where this exact thing happened, like 1992, where an individual died suddenly during a prone restraint attempt. And as I think of the research that's been done on this, it seems to me there's almost two poles to this. On the one pole, there's research that's been done that says the prone restraint position is no problem, there's minimal risk, and really nothing to be concerned about. And then at the other pole, there's research that's been done that said, well, hold on, wait a minute here. I think that there is concern and there's medical risks and dangers involved. So what was it, Jeff, that caused you and your colleague to want to wade into the middle of this debate and look at the issue of prone restraint?
Yeah, I feel like I've been pulled into a cauldron that I may not have voluntarily, entirely wanted to be in, but it really just came from the nature of our work. Primarily, people come to us to answer biomechanical questions regarding incidents that either cause injury or death. And a lot of the time that involves use of force. And so we started getting lawyers calling us to specifically on prone restraint deaths. And some of them very high profile. You might have heard of the Bronstein file and what happened with that. That was really the file. There was a few before that where we started to stop short of the physiology because we felt, there was a physician on file. They should really take that over. That's their domain. And then we started to realize, well, physiology is part of our domain. at least to the point where the effects of the biomechanics are concerned. And we started to expand our reach a little bit. And according to my engineering license and EGBC, who regulates me for the public protection, I'm allowed to interpret scientific literature, no matter what the topic. So that's all within my scope of practice. And we just started to have this scope creep with respect to prone restraint deaths until the Bronstein file. And at the Bronstein file, we realized that the physicians we had been working with previously really didn't understand the problem, nor did they read the research. So we understood that there was an issue on the medical professional side, and on the law enforcement side, or at least the advocates for law enforcement, were dead set against any weight on the back in the prone position as being anything or having any problematic issues at all. And so it just seemed like two very extreme views in our mind. And so we started looking at this a little bit more. And we realized that just due to first principles, for example, like just the laws of physics, weight on the back really didn't make sense. And we started to look at what the physicians were saying. And we found these studies from Steinberg, who, in my opinion, is doing a really good job advancing this understanding. And I read just a pre-proof of his recently that's not published yet, nor is ours, by the way. It's still in the pre-proof stage. So the copy that you got, Chris, is actually prior to publication, but it has been accepted. And so know that experts have reviewed this and given it the thumbs up. But anyways, we started looking into Steinberg, and in his pre-proof, he did a worldwide study, at least the way he defines it. There's millions and millions of case studies involved in that pre-proof. And what he found in these sudden death cases, that 94% of them were prone, 74% of them had documented some sort of weight on the back. And the other percentage that I don't mention is I don't think well defined in there, but we simply don't know. So there could have been, but it wasn't documented, so we don't know. So he doesn't include it. But those two percentages are extremely high from a research standpoint. And so there must be something going on here. And so he's busy working on the epidemiology of it. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if we started looking at this from an engineering perspective, and engineering plus the known physiology. And that's the direction we took, because no one had ever described the physics behind it before. And then combining that with the known physiology within our scope, I think brought this new paper to fruition. But having listened to myself and thinking about this, where I think a lot of the issues lie is that we're talking about a multidiscipline problem here. We're talking about law enforcement who are out there well-meaning, trying to develop a situation or create a situation that's safe for them and the person that's not cooperating. I mean, that right there is its own world, as you know. And then we have physicians that are looking into performing the autopsies and looking into this and don't necessarily have the time to dig into the research and giving their opinion and kind of muddling a little bit, and not to, I'm not trying to cut anyone down, but I mean, it does take an enormous amount of work to get up to speed on that research. And then there's other people, scientists, that are also well-meaning, but perhaps have chosen a side legally or work in this industry and then approach their work from that bias. And it's interesting to me because not one, somebody asked me the other day during a presentation how many prone restraint papers there are. And I kind of cheekily, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, put up my hand and I said 0. Because nobody's been able to replicate the conditions of those scenarios yet in research. And in fact, there's some research papers that we cite in this new paper that actually exclude for things like anxiety disorders. Well, guess what? Anxiety is actually a risk factor that goes along with our line of thinking of this buildup of carbon dioxide that you can't off gas. And anxiety is one risk factor that makes that condition worse. So the research subjects themselves are designed not to create these conditions that we're seeing in the field where these people die. So it really is like blind men standing around an elephant and poking the elephant or feeling the elephant with one hand and trying to describe what they see. But if you talk to each one of those blind men, there is a common theme, and that common theme is that the off-gassing of CO2 is problematic with these patients. And that really is now the segue to kind of get into the risk factors and all that. But
Sure.
it's not like one side's right and the other side's wrong. And it's not like this new information, or at least new understanding or new perspective, whatever you want to call it, is going to change much on the street. Except at the very end of the talk, I mean, I'll say it now, but at the very end of the talk, if there was a take-home message, it would be 100% you have to do your job. There's no one that's going to say that you shouldn't. But restrain them, sit them up, and do it in a timely fashion. Those would be, if there was any take home for the street cop, that would be it. Because when you keep them in that position, there's a myriad of things that can go wrong, especially if those other risk factors are present. And time is of the essence. In the Bronstein case, just to give you an example.
Yeah, could you give us a bit of a snapshot of that case, Jeff? What was it, and what was the outcome on that?
Okay, so Bronstein was a chronic meth user, and he was on the watch list for family services that if he did not submit regular blood samples that were clean, that family services were going to take his daughter. Okay, so that's the scenario. So I don't know if this was a random check or a regular check, but 5 law enforcement officers, a cameraman, and a nurse arrive and say, okay, it's time for your regular blood checkup. And he refused. And I'm not a policymaker, I'm not law enforcement, I'm not a legal person, but right there, I think there should have been implications for him. If he's refusing a blood test, something, maybe we can change this whole scenario by saying, okay, we assume he's positive. But regardless, it continues. And they say, no, we're here to take your blood test. This is what you're subject to. Here's all the legal ramifications. We have the right to do this. We have this cameraman. This is all being videotaped, by the way. No, I'm not going to do this. And I guess about 10 or 20 minutes go by. And they say, okay, this is your last chance. The sergeant that was there, I believe it was him that said, this is your last chance. Otherwise, we're going to forcefully take this blood draw. He still declines. So they put him onto a mat. And that's another risk factor, by the way. A compliant surface will help these individuals. Now, I get it. The average street crop doesn't always have access to a pad. But if there is a choice between grass and asphalt, put him on the grass. Or her. So anyways, they put him on a compliant mat. And there's weight on his legs. There's weight on his arms. There is weight on his upper back. And then there's a nurse trying to get a needle in. Within the first minute of that happening, he says repeatedly 11 times between minute 1 and minute 2, I can't breathe. Okay, and I did that. I actually repeated that. It took me something like 32 seconds or 37 seconds to say that 11 times. And so for the most part of that second minute, he's talking. And from a first aider's point of view, like I'm a trained medic, if they're talking, their airway's clear. Okay? But what it doesn't tell you is if the respirations are adequate. Okay? And that is a belief. I've heard that many times in these audios. If you're talking to me, you can breathe. I've heard that on audio before. And so, yes, the airway's clear, but it doesn't necessarily mean the breathing that's present is adequate. Nor does it tell you, is it becoming more adequate or less adequate? Okay, and that's super important here. Because at 2 minutes, he goes silent, his lips start turning blue, and the officers, not necessarily the medical professional that was on site, the officers start to realize that something's wrong. And one of them says, hey, dude, he's turning purple. And I believe somebody asked, should we keep going? You hear in the background, yes, keep going. And I don't know who this nurse, anyways, 7 minutes later, 7 minutes into this ordeal, so he's been unresponsive for 5 minutes now. They finally get the blood draw. At 8 minutes, he's placed in the recovery position, and soon thereafter, they realize something's very wrong, and CPR started, and he's never revived. The outcome of that file is disastrous from a law enforcement perspective, in the sense that all 7 people present were charged with involuntary manslaughter, as well as there was some duty of care charges and some assault charges that were also laid up to, I don't know what the exact sentence was, but it was up to 4 years on the criminal side. On the civil side, there was a $24 million payout to the family. I mean, these are horrendous numbers. And this should be motivation that we do not understand this as well as we think we do. And I believe that, I'm so glad, Chris, that you recognize this. I love this about you. And I'm so glad that, I've always wanted to do this talk with you, but we needed the right topic because, like I said, I'm an engineer. And so very rarely do I really overlap with the needs on the street. But I think this is a topic where it does that. And so hopefully by the end of this hour, we've gotten enough information out there that people can take it and start to maybe modify how they do things, or at least understand better what the risks are when they're doing it, so that they can recognize problems quicker and perhaps preemptively get them in positions that we know are better suited for respiratory exchange and reduced anxiety.
Absolutely. And I think you already gave law enforcement one huge takeaway, Jeff, because perhaps a big misunderstanding, and it's something that we do certainly hear in these cases where they're fighting with somebody and they're saying, I can't breathe, is you immediately think, well, you're talking so you can breathe. But so to me, the takeaway from what I heard you say is not confusing somebody's ability to talk with adequate ventilation. They may actually be in a serious medical jeopardy and spiraling to perhaps a fatal outcome, even though they're talking correctly. So that's a huge takeaway for officers.
Yeah. Thank you. And here's the thing, talking to officers, if criminals find this out, what's the first thing they're going to say when they get proned out? That's the problem. But it's better that officers know this up front, I think, and they can do whatever they need to do, because I think that's still legitimate. People understand that they need to do their job. Somebody's not cooperating, and a prone position is safer. It's safer for the officer, and it's actually safer for the person, as long as that position is not maintained for any amount of time.
Right, and I think that's an important to couple with that previous comment, that you're not saying that officers shouldn't put people into a face down prone position and get control in that. But the takeaway is that, do your job like you're saying, but recognize there's an urgency, there's an exigency to get this person into a proper position as soon as possible after you have control.
100%. 100%.
Okay, so why don't we, you sent a bit of a wonderful slide deck over, and if you want to share your screen, maybe you can walk us through some of the principles in that.
Absolutely. So I think we've pretty much covered the why of it, but I'm going to go through this anyways just so it's uber clear. The purpose of doing this was to understand the risk factors involved with prone restraint related death. It was clear when we started getting files in this area that there was a real bipolar understanding, if you wish, and perhaps a misunderstanding. And we didn't want to go down either route. We just wanted to get it right and then communicate that information and understand the mechanism of death, or at least the primary contributor to death. Okay, and that's very different than saying the true cause. The primary contributor of death, and it's not what you might think. And then provide this background so that police practices people and policymakers could go ahead and make the changes necessary. But I'm just going to advance this, and if we do anything today, I think to get through some of these, or at least some of these 8 risk factors associated with prone restraint that focus on biomechanics and physiology, I think will be really benefiting the industry, because nobody's looked at it from the biomechanics point of view, and I think few people have understood the line of thinking from a physiology perspective, at least the way we're thinking of it and others like Steinberg are thinking about it. And then understand how prone restraint can lead to metabolic acidosis. And if you don't know, I'm just going to say this right up front, that acidosis is a change in pH. It's a lowering of the pH or an increase in concentration of H plus ions dissolved in the blood. And if you read the literature on that, you'll see that there's a large increase in risk for cardiac arrest. And that's where we stop here. So we look at the biomechanics, we talk about the associated physiology, and we say, look, here's how all of this leads to metabolic acidosis, and we understand the risk of cardiac arrest in that situation, and then we stop there. We don't actually bridge the gap between the causation of acidosis and cardiac arrhythmias. I think that's the job of a cardiac surgeon or a cardiac physician. But let me skip forward here. Let me talk about, let's talk about this one. Some pretty basic mechanics. And as I said, we looked at this from a biomechanical point of view as well as a physiological point of view. And what's the point of sharing rib motion? Well, because it leads to street practices. It leads to police practices over time. And if I was to tell you, or the average person, I guess, if somebody's prone, and I said, okay, there's muscles that lift the rib cage forward and up, as we see here on the right-hand side in the pump handle motion. And then we prone that same person out. I think it's easy for people to understand, if I put weight on that person's back, it becomes more difficult for them to perform this pump handle motion, right? I think that's easy to get. And that it would require additional muscle recruitment in order to change the volume of the lungs during that situation. And it's really the change in volume that gives us air exchange, right? We increase the volume, we decrease the pressure, that draws air in, right? So we need to keep that tidal volume, we call it, necessary, at a necessary minimum. So even just from this understanding of how pump handle motion works, you can see how weight on the back would create a condition where we've got to recruit more muscles. Well, as we talked about before the show even started, when we're recruiting more muscles, what are we doing? We're creating more CO2. And when we create more CO2, we generate more H plus ions, and hence we start down the road of metabolic acidosis just from here. But then let's talk about the bucket handle motion. This is movement out and away from the spine. Okay, well, there's people that are suggesting, and you can look at NYPD is doing this now, where they call it the wrap restraint or something similar to that, where they put somebody on their side, wrap up their legs and wrap up their arms, but they still load up the chest. Now, you'll see in a moment that being on your side is actually more advantageous than being prone, but it doesn't completely alleviate the issue because we're still loading up this bucket handle motion mechanically if we're loading through the ribs from top to bottom when the person's on their side. Okay? Now, let's jump ahead to this diagram because everybody understands. We don't need to go into the nitty-gritty of, why we breathe. We're bringing oxygen into the tissue and we're off-gassing CO2. That's just how biology works. But did you know it's set up in bias of O2? A lot of people early on in the early 90s were thinking this was an asphyxiation type of issue. Mm-hmm. And it still is in some cases when you've got physical restriction of the airways. That is, in fact, asphyxiation. But have a look at this. There is a natural bias set up in biology to uptake O2. So have a look on this, on the left-hand side, we have this diffusion gradient from 0 to 45 millimeters of mercury, or I should say 45 millimeters of mercury to 0 to off-gas CO2, but a much larger gradient between 150 approximately millimeters of mercury in inhaled air to 40 millimeters of mercury in the blood. And so blood is arriving on the left-hand side of the screen here, blood arriving in the pulmonary capillaries. And we're making this exchange as we go across the pulmonary capillaries. And you can see there's this natural gradient to bring O2 in rather than off gas naturally. And this is continued because carbon dioxide largely is dissolved in the blood. But O2, as you may or may not know, but most people do know, O2 will get taken up by hemoglobin, right? And so what is that effectively doing? It's taking O2 and integrating it into a protein. So in other words, it's no longer diffused or dissolved in the blood. So you maintain the gradient of O2, right? So if I just play this, as that blood flows across, we end up off-gassing only 5 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide, but we take up 60 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. Not only due to the natural diffusion gradient, but also because of the maintained diffusion gradient of O2 being taken up by hemoglobin. So already, just biologically, we're set up at a natural bias to have issues or a more sensitive system to off-gassing CO2. Okay? But let's take a look at this slide. This is one that everyone will understand. What a buildup of carbon dioxide will do is change the pH. pH is just a logarithmic scale that is telling you the concentration of H plus ions. Okay? And it's very similar to trying to keep the balance of your pool. Okay, that's why Everybody understands that, your hot tub, your pool, what have you. And it's very, very sensitive. And it doesn't take a lot of change or increase in H plus ions in order to become acidic. And if your blood becomes too acidic, then you can get into a state called metabolic acidosis, which can cause arrhythmias, and arrhythmias can lead to cardiac arrest. And now we're starting to enter the domain of the physician. But that's why this is an issue. That's why this takes some time. That's why we need to understand the risk factors that contribute to the buildup of carbon dioxide so we can recognize them, act quickly enough to prevent them slipping across this acidosis threshold.
So that's great.
Okay.
I have one question on that. So, yeah, just one question there, Jeff. So this is all because of CO2 buildup, right? That you're talking about going into this state, this acidosis, because CO2 continues to build up in the bloodstream and it's not being eliminated or off gassed, so it keeps building up. Is that right? So then we end up into this acidosic state.
The short answer is yes. Now, depending on which risk factor you look at, the contribution mechanism will be different. For example, methamphetamine, for example, it will deregulate respiration needs. So for example, if we start to have a buildup of carbon dioxide, it won't recognize the need to off-gas that. And so there's this disconnect between what the nervous system used to do to compensate for a buildup of carbon dioxide, and the brain doesn't get that feedback because of the drug. Okay? With struggling, you mentioned struggling at the beginning of this interview. Struggling is a big one because I'm involving a huge amount of muscle mass in a struggle, and that's all creating carbon dioxide that has to get buffered somehow. And that buffering system creates H plus ions. H plus ions changes the blood acidity of the blood. Or changes the blood acidity, sorry. And so each mechanism will work just slightly differently, but they all contribute to the blood acidity.
Okay. Now, what about...
Is that more clear?
Yeah, that is clear, certainly with CO2. Where does lactic acid fit into all of this? How does that also, exacerbate this acidosis state, just the buildup of lactic acid that's being released by the muscles?
100%. Lactic acid is very similar in that it kicks off H plus ions that reduce that reduce blood acidity as well, or increase blood acidity as well. But slightly different mechanism. It's due to type 2 glycolytic fibers, and the diaphragm, as people may or may not know, is actually relatively high percentage type 2 muscle fibers, which means if you need to increase the work for breathing, you're actually increasing the amount of lactic acid that you're producing. And so the effect of having to breathe, the effect of having to have more work to breathe only accelerates the problematic condition.
Okay, so both of these things are contributing to a more perilous state medically then.
100%. So let's get into some of these. You mentioned struggle, so let's just. I mean, we kind of covered that off actually, but just since I've got it open. Here is the slide on the first risk factor, which is increased muscular activity. So contraction of the muscles requires metabolic energy to perform work, extracting O2 from the blood and releasing CO2. Another reason why this isn't an O2 problem, at least in the condition that we're talking about here, is that when there is a buildup of CO2 in the blood, it actually reduces the affinity for O2 at the tissues. So hemoglobin will readily offload O2 if there's a lot of CO2 present. So it recognizes, hey, these muscles are doing a lot of work, we should probably give it more oxygen, and it ends up doing that. And that's vice versa for the lungs. So when that same hemoglobin is in the lungs and there happens to be high carbon dioxide in that region of the body, we get an increased affinity for O2. So it's a really interesting system, and that bias that I talked about before also contributes to that. But know that there's also an increased offloading of carbon dioxide at the tissue level if there's more CO2 there. But you're in fact absolutely correct that if we're struggling, if we've ran from the police and we're in the middle of trying to not be arrested, that we're producing a lot of CO2 that needs to be off-gassed. Okay? But there's also this concept. So influence of prone position on respiration. What does increased intra-abdominal pressure really mean? Okay, it's important to understand that the abdomen and the thorax are inextricably linked as far as pressure is concerned. So right away, in a position like this, in an average healthy person, there may not be a lot of added pressure to the abdomen, but as you increase body weight and adipose tissue around the belly, you're definitely increasing intra-abdominal pressure just because it gets getting compressed into the body itself. It's compressing the internal organs. That includes the diaphragm, and then of course includes the thoracic cavity, increasing that pressure. And if you're increasing the pressure on the lungs, that means you've got to do more work in order to increase the volume of those lungs. And because you're now prone, just the sheer weight of your body is also increasing the work. Okay? So if you were to, for example, not change how you're breathing, you would reduce the volume that you can take in overall. And if there is enough weight on your back that it physically reduces the volume, no matter how hard you're contracting your accessory muscles, that means you have to breathe at a higher rate of breathing, okay? And if you're breathing at a higher rate, well, now you're also exponentially increasing the amount of work of breathing, and you're also increasing the amount of dead space, because the air that's involved in respiration is in the alveoli. If it's stuck in the bronchi, that's not a useful place to be stuck. And if I'm increasing the number of breaths per minute, then I equally multiply or increase the amount of dead space over that same amount of time. So it reduces the efficiency of breathing just by being prone. Okay? Now, if we add body weight, this just gets exacerbated. Okay, so the second risk factor is obesity. So if there's increased pressure on the lungs and alveoli, there's just even more in someone who's obese. Reduced volume, even more, and force required, even more. And people that are obese, when you read the literature, they're already immediately at a disadvantage. Their normal tidal volumes are reduced because they're obese. But not only that, they have decreased lung compliance as being obese. And what I mean by that is the if you think of compliance is like the amount something deforms based on a given load. So if it deforms less, that means in order to move the same volume, you've got to use higher pressures. If you're using higher pressures, you're using more muscular activity, you're creating more carbon dioxide. And so that's how this risk factor is involved in building up carbon dioxide. But what does it mean to be obese? And this is my first criticism of the research that's existing, is that everyone's using the measurement of BMI. And you know, I'm sure you've used BMI before, or at least seen it in medical records during homicides or deceased medical records. It's just simply weight divided by the square of somebody's height. It does not consider bone density. It does not consider the weight of muscle with respect to the weight of adipose tissue. And there are publications upon publications saying that BMI is actually not a good measurement of obesity. And yet every article I came across in this new research uses BMI as a measurement of obesity. Okay? And I'm not wearing my business thong right now, but I actually have a BMI of 28. So I'm class 1, almost class 1 obese, but clearly overweight according to the scale. And, I'm clearly not. And so risk factor obesity is definitely one of them. But we have to clean this up in the literature. That's the point. But there's a whole nother aspect to this. And that is in Sloan 2010, they looked at specific measurements in obese people, and they found that there was automatically a reduced functional residual capacity. What is reduced functional residual capacity? It's the amount of air left over from a natural exhalation. Okay, you can see it there on the bottom right. Therefore, right away, anyone who's obese has to increase the rate of breathing due to decreased tidal volume. Okay? Now, have a look. Compare these results with these results. This is Campbell 2023. Very, very, very interesting study in my opinion. And because they were so cold and objective about the results, this paper is not receiving the attention it deserves. Have a look at B. Okay, B is the difference in functional residual capacity from normal prone to after exercise and weighted. Okay? B is also the condition where hands are simply placed behind the back or behind the head. Okay, C is actually hands placed at side. Yes, they're still prone, and yet we're not getting the same effect of that decrease in functional residual capacity. What's interesting here is that the functional residual capacity never stops decreasing. And that should be alarm bells, because what happens at 6 minutes? What happens at 7 minutes in this condition? Do they simply bottom out? Because if we're heading down the road of zero functional residual capacity, what does that mean functionally? That means lung collapse is what that means. Okay? And so all we've done is change a position from hands by the side prone to hands behind the back or hands behind the head prone. And we get this monotonically decreasing functional residual capacity from control conditions. That's super, super important. And obese people are already starting at a reduced functional residual capacity. And I hate to say that word that many times in that span of time frame, but these are the measurements people are taking. I think the take-home message here is that, the lay terms here is that obese people already have abnormal respiratory function. I think is probably a good way to say it. You add the load to their back in a specific position after exercise, and whether they're fat or obese or healthy weight, they continue to decrease the amount of air that's left in their body. And the hypothesis here, this hasn't been shown as to why this is, but the hypothesis is that in these what we called restraint prone positions, either behind your back or behind your head, that are loaded up, you have to change your strategy for breathing in order to try to make it as efficient as possible. So in other words, you're using a lot of accessory muscles. You're using abdominal muscles, the transverse abdominis, internal, external, intercostal muscles, all these types of muscles to recruit, to create a volume that will allow you to create a tidal volume that will allow you to respire effectively. However, as those major muscles start to fatigue, as they would when you've got 35% of your body weight sitting on your back, as they fatigue over time, their ability to create that efficient condition decreases. And so that's why your functional residual capacity, or the amount of air that's left in your lungs after a natural expiration, starts to decrease, increasing this risk of total lung collapse. So, I mean, how about them apples? I mean, seriously, this is some pretty major stuff that nobody's talking about.
Right, absolutely.
And, I don't want to just hog the airwaves here, but I thought that was an important point to get across, because nowhere do I see that finding being combined in a way that I think is understandable to the average person.
Yeah, no.
Even just the term functional residual capacity is a mouthful.
It is. It definitely is. And so, as you were looking at all of the research and you saw these areas where they weren't really pulling these risk factors out and looking at them adequately, I think what I really appreciated about when I went through your whole slide deck is those 8 risk factors that you're talking about. So far we've covered 2, which is the prone restraint itself, which already compromises breathing. Then we have obesity, and especially if we end up putting weight force on prone people's backs, that's going to exacerbate it. But you had other risk factors as well, Jeff. So where would we go from there? What's the next risk factor in the whole cascade of medical crises?
The next risk factor in that, and it's not going to be a surprise to anyone who's listening to this, is drugs, right? Like meth, opioids, cocaine, they all have this ability to mess with our nervous system's ability to regulate carbon dioxide, believe it or not. And so, and we can go to those studies if you like. Let me just pull them up. I just didn't want to. Okay. So let's go to meth. Very quickly, what happens when we increase the concentration per kilogram of body weight? Well, we increase heart rate, and most people will interpret that. It's an easy measurement to take, which is why we see it in every study. And that's a problem. That's why, part of the things that you should be evaluating in research is, why did they take the measurements they did? And often the answer is because it's relatively related and it's easy to take. But the general interpretation is that we're increasing metabolism without extra activity level. Okay, but on the right-hand side, have a look at this. As we increase meth, we increase expired CO2. Now, you have to take this with a bit of a grain of salt. And I mentioned it earlier about the bicarbonate buffer system. That is a time-dependent system in the sense that you will see increases in expired CO2 of people that just start to go for a jog, for example. So if you go from resting, you tie on your shoes, and within the first minute or two of you jogging, you will get a large increase in expired CO2 because your bicarbonate system has yet to be triggered. Okay, you're creating a bunch of extra CO2, it's being dissolved, and it's being off-gassed without being buffered yet. And so we have to switch that system on, but when you switch that system on, you start to decrease the amount of expired CO2. Now, as you can imagine, if your theory is that a buildup of CO2 is an issue, and you get people to exercise for, let's say, 4 minutes, and you measure a decrease in expired CO2, you can see how researchers might be led down the wrong path by believing it's not a buildup of CO2, when in fact it is. You just haven't overwhelmed the buffering system yet. Do you follow?
I am. Yep. That
awesome.
Makes sense. Yep.
That's because you're smart, and I appreciate that. That's awesome. And you know, same thing when you look at the regulatory controls with meth. You know, when we get an increase in CO2, that actually stimulates an increase in blood pressure. Well, when we get an increase in blood pressure, the nervous system's supposed to regulate heart rate in order to counterbalance that increase in blood pressure. And in fact, what we get is dysregulation, or impairs the response to increased CO2. So even though we get an increase in CO2, we're not getting the off-gassing that we should be in a situation like that. So you can see how that would be, you know, very problematic very quickly if in combination with these other risk factors. Another risk factor, and I don't want to just give away my webinar, but anxiety is also a big deal. Why? Because we're hyperventilating. So there's this idea that there's this perceived lack of oxygen that increases vasoconstriction, and actually because of that we increase the stiffness, or we decrease the compliance of the airways, and so we have increased airway resistance, which increases the work, which decreases the efficiency of breathing. And so this is part of the reason why some studies actually chose research subjects that did not have an anxiety disorder. So they would exclude people that say they had some sort of anxiety disorders, because this would either increase their risk, number one, or number two, probably more likely why they excluded them was that it would be a confounding factor to their research. And so it now becomes, difficult. It's like, how do we separate these risk factors? And we can get into that in a bit, but
so this is an interesting one to me, this anxiety and panic, because it's one that I never really appreciated, that how it actually affects behavior in like these struggles for control. And somebody, if their CO2 is increasing, if it's escalating inside, and it's triggering all of this, like all of these other physiology, but also the psychology, which is I can't breathe, and the panic and the automatic response. I mean, the midbrain response to recover the ability to breathe is so powerful that, and I think I had a case where an officer was trying to restrain an individual with a vascular neck restraint, and it turned into a respiratory neck restraint unknown to the officer during this big struggle.
Yeah.
And the individual couldn't breathe, and he clearly was panicking. You could see in the video that he was just doing everything he could to try to recover the ability to breathe. But the officer interpreted the action as intentional resistance and fighting to overcome the officer's response. So when I saw you had anxiety in there, it really caused me to stop and think about, that psychological state of these individuals that's causing behavioral actions as well.
Well, I love that take. And whoops, I just accidentally locked my screen, so I have to insert there we go. It brings us to this figure, actually. I think I'm still sharing screen. Can you see that?
No, I can't see your screen.
Okay, let me share. There we go. What you just said is all about this slide here. So nothing happens in isolation, right? These are all compounding factors. And if we've somehow generated anxiety either through paperwork that says I'm going to lose my child if I test positive, or I've got 5 officers clamoring around after this chase and I don't want to be arrested or go to jail, or now I'm getting this sensation that I can't breathe, and I'm trying to fight that, and they're immobilizing me. Well, what does that do to my anxiety? That might increase my anxiety, and then that increases the amount of effort for immobilization, which increases anxiety, and all of a sudden our carbon dioxide, which is what those blue balls are representing, starts to go through the roof. And that is, I think what's important to state here is that it is unbeknownst to anyone there, including the officers. Yeah. And that is such a insightful, and I don't believe that that's clearly understood by everyone that's involved in this. So good on you for that. But let's talk about that just for a moment, is the difference between downward force and immobilization. Downward force, as we saw with the Campbell study, it ends up compressing large thoracic vessels, so you reduce the amount of blood returning to the lungs to actually make that exchange. That's a neat animation. That's the first time I've seen that, actually. But reduce blood flow to the lungs leads to less CO2 is expelled, which leads to, hypercapnia cascade.
And hypercapnia,
overdoing
that's just hypercapnia, Jeff. That's a word just to say that there's been massive CO2 buildup, and you're in that state. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so immobilization is something that hasn't been studied yet, actually. And one thing that we're seeing in the videos that we receive for these cases, and just in general description, is that, look, we just wanted to prevent him from moving. We were trying to get restraints on him, and he was resisting arrest, and so we prevented him from changing that position. But what is different about the research, where they just place a 200-pound bag of sand on somebody's back, which is static, and that person is generally healthy in that research and also generally not obese. So you can see, we add one risk factor, then we take away 3, why those people don't necessarily have an issue of respiring effectively. In a situation like this, we've got someone who is perhaps already in a state of high heart rate and respiration and high respiratory rate, and is built up some CO2 and is now being restrained, and it's being interpreted by the officers and maybe rightfully so. You know, this is where I have to back off as a scientist. I don't know. I'm not there. But I can tell you from a scientific point of view, immobilization is a dynamic response to the movements of the subject. So in other words, if the hips move, there's additional pressure to one side or the other. Or if the person's trying to place their hands by their side, the officer responds by grabbing the wrist and placing it back on the back with perhaps additional force onto the lower back. Things like that. There's this dynamic aspect to immobilization, and adjusting on both the subject's point of view, but also law enforcement's point of view. And that is a scenario that hasn't been studied yet. There was a study, it's cited in our research, where they took BMI greater than 30, not necessarily perhaps statistically overweight, but doesn't necessarily mean obese. They're young. Okay, so these, were they football players? I don't know. I'd like to ask the authors that. And then they were placed in various restraint and maximal restraint positions and asked to struggle against the restraint without load on their back. Okay? And so, yes, heart rate went up. Yes, tidal volume went up. But we weren't told if the respiratory rate went up. And so there's all these complicating factors that really don't tell us much about the situation. And then the conclusion is that, okay, there's some decline in the measurements, but nothing that would be statistically problematic for these people to respire effectively. And then it stopped. It's not considered further. Although they do, what I appreciate about that research is that they go into the limitations. Is that, yeah, these are healthy, these are generally young, they're not chronic, drug abusers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that I think it was that one, or at least another one, state that this doesn't replicate the dynamic situation of what we're trying to describe here as immobilization. So,
yeah. So we're quickly bumping up onto an hour here, Jeff. But I wonder, in the interest of time, because I really want to make sure that you have a slide in there that I thought was really helpful, and it was the things that are totally outside of an officer's control, things that are mostly outside of their control, and then there was a category of where officers can make a difference. And I'd love for you to, because I think this needs to be like the takeaway, right? What can I do as an officer? I need to fight with these people. I need to get control of them. It's going to be in a prone position until we get control. And so where can I then make a difference in this?
Sure. So again, this is our interpretation. And if you, Chris, even have some suggestions to improve this, I'd be open to it. But obviously, obesity isn't something that we're going to be able to change on site. Totally out of the officer's control. Drugs, primarily out of the officer's control, but I've overlapped it with mostly out of your control because of things like Narcan, right? This is not something that would be carried in a patrol car, but if we knew this was an opioid-related incident, then perhaps EMS can be called and Narcan be administered, and we can kind of remove this risk factor. But let's face it, the time that it's going to require to do that is likely out of their control.
I think actually, the majority of frontline officers now are issued Narcan, and they carry them with them on their persons,
Really?
or at least in their patrol cars. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's more commonplace. So I think you might be onto something there as far as being able to reduce the risk of this acidosis even by the rapid administration of Narcan if in these struggles.
Awesome. That's great to hear. And yes, and so we could reduce the effect of the opioids by Narcan administration. We didn't get into hard surface risk factors, but again, mostly out of your control. If you're in a concrete jungle, there's going to be no compliant surfaces around. But I would say if there is grass present, then that would be the place to take them down or shift them to or move them to. If the prone restraint is required for any other time than the immediate restraints being applied. Struggle, again, mostly out of your control. Likely commands have been given at this point. Everyone's, the evil word, these days is not excited delirium. It's de-escalation, so, and I hate to bring that up. It's not my area. And there's a lot of debate on whether or not it even works. I mean, for someone who doesn't want to comply, they're not going to comply. And we all understand that, but I put it in the mostly out of our control just in case someone wanted to argue that point. Anxiety, we looked at the results of that are very similar to struggle and the buildup of carbon dioxide. Again, good communication, and perhaps the recognition of an authentic, I got to be careful here, but applying the restraints and sitting them up in a timely fashion is really the best way to avoid all of these ones that we've talked about so far. But downward force is something that you can reduce. Now, obviously, if somebody's non-compliant, this is going to be difficult to do. Some of the alternative choices that have been put forth are to try to restrain them while they're on their side, or place them in something like the wrap that NYPD is now training for. But I think the big one here is downward force on the upper back. If it can be placed somewhere else, like perhaps on the limbs, but you still have a little bit of movement in the shoulders, and I know that's a lot to ask, but I'm just saying from a scientific standpoint, that would make a difference. But I think where this all boils down is time. Because as we add risk factors, we start to compound the problematic issue of building up carbon dioxide, and that can be reduced as soon as we sit them up. But I understand, and I think everyone would understand, that you need to get them under restraints before you do that.
So time there, it seems to me that time can refer to two aspects here. One would be, well, maybe even three. One is time under ideal circumstances, can we, as law enforcement, can we wait before we actually put hands on and go on physical control until we've got our sufficient resources there to be able to do it quickly and effectively, till we've got EMS maybe on scene and they're prepared whatever their cocktail is that they're going to be giving. So we've got that time of a delayed actual interaction when possible. I mean, in most cases, that's outside of the officer's control as well. And then we have the time of the duration of the struggle, how long this fight actually goes on for. And I think this is where, and it's my message to law enforcement when I teach, is the thing that's safest always for officers and for subjects is to reduce the duration of a violent encounter, because the longer that it goes on, the increase in severe injuries to both subjects and officers occurs. And what I'm hearing you say is the longer that intense struggle is allowed to become protracted, that there's a increase in continual CO2 buildup in the body, which is also implicated in potential cardiac events here. And then I think the third time is after you have control of the individual, get them, like you're saying, into a properly seated position where more normal ventilation can take place. So I'll throw that out there as my hypothesis, and I'm interested in your feedback on that.
Well, I would say it's no longer, it's out of my hands at this point. I think, what I've heard you say, Chris, is that you understand what we're saying, and you're making suggestions from a law enforcement position that would make the situation better or more safe for both officers and the person that you're trying to place in restraints. And I would say if that's what you see as being the way forward, then that is the way forward for you. And that's kind of where I would have to draw the line for our recommendations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So what's next then in this I guess in the areas of research, Jeff? What are important takeaways other than what we've already said? Is there anything that you'd want to say in conclusion?
Absolutely. To the researchers interested in this, I would say stop using BMI as a way to measure obesity. I would use something that captures abdominal fat, especially, is what's important here. There's different protocols out there that use calipers. I would also do a direct measurement. Stop this end tidal CO2 production. Don't worry about that because of it just gets overly complicated with the buffering system involved, and you don't know when it's getting switched on or switched off. So you need to measure blood pH directly. Okay, so you get that confirmation of what the H plus concentration actually is in the blood. I would say there needs to be research done on immobilization. So, we got it, static load on the back. We think we understand that now. Let's get into more dynamic scenarios and, what we talked about here as being immobilization. I would try to induce anxiety. However, ethically you can do that. I would also select for chronic drug users. It would be unethical to bring in a healthy person and load them up on meth, but even though there might be volunteers for that, I think the way to do it is to select for chronic drug users. And then, I guess the end thing to consider is all of this still ethical? Because the more risk factors we apply, the closer we get to those conditions. How close are we getting to inducing arrhythmias and cardiac arrest? I mean, I don't know if anyone knows that yet. And so, but those are the steps that need to change in the research in order to further understand this issue.
Okay, wonderful. And Jeff, your paper, Physiology and Biomechanics of Prone Restraint Respiration, can you tell us where that's going to be published and when you expect it to be available?
It is going to be published in Medicine, Science and the Law, which is the journal of the British Academy of Forensic Sciences. And it has been accepted there. We just finished the proofing process. And if you join our newsletter, I promise not to spam you, and I promise to send you a copy of the PDF when it's available.
Wonderful. And on that point, your newsletter, and also can you, in the last time we have here, tell us about your Science of Violence programs online training that are available, and how can our listeners take advantage of that?
Sure. Well, if you go to our website, which is gtdscientific.com, you'll notice a section called The Science of Violence. And if you go in there, you can click around and you'll see an introductory course on biomechanics. That's about 90 minutes or so. And then there's a fundamental course on biomechanics and injury analysis, which is about 4 hours long. And then we're just posting, I think it was there today, I'd have to check, but I know we're in the middle of posting our most popular recent webinar, which is the biomechanics from video evidence, is going to get posted, and you can watch that online, which is about a 2-hour presentation. And then tomorrow, we'll be presenting the slideshow that we just saw in a webinar, and we'll be cutting that down. We'll be editing it nicely and placing that on the website as well, so you'll be able to see the science behind prone restraint deaths there soon.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, Jeff, thank you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Geoffrey Desmoulin, principal of GTD Scientific. Jeff, thanks so much for making the time to talk to Trainers Bullpen.
You're welcome, Chris. Take care.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainers Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainers Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.